Hey there, everyone. My name is AJ, and I'm the host of the Road to Reason podcast. Today's guest is Todd May, a philosophy professor at Clemson University. Originally, his scholarly focus was directed at post-structuralist French thinkers such as Foucault and Deleuze, but recently his work has taken a position to focus on more imminent, larger-scale, day-to-day issues that pervade our lives, such as death, significance, and what it means to be a good person in a modern age. In addition to his scholarly productivity, which includes 16 book publications, he also contributes outside the university as well, teaching, for instance, in a local prison. We cover a wide range of topics, including but not limited to French postmodernism, how the pandemic is affecting our sense of vulnerability, mortality, and what it means to live decently in a modern world. I hope you enjoy the conversation. In your opinion, what is the most beautiful idea in philosophy and why?
Great. AJ, this is a great question. And it's an interesting one, right? Because it's not what's the truest idea, what's the most important idea. It's what's the most beautiful idea. And I've been thinking about that. And here's what I'm coming up with. There's a philosopher, Maurice Merleau-Ponty. He's in the generation before Foucault and Derrida and Deleuze. He's known as a phenomenologist, but I think he's actually more complicated than that. In any event, his idea is that our corporeality, our body, and the world are intertwined in such a way that they're not two things that come together, but two poles of a single relationship. And he adds to that the idea that our minds are embodied. So there is a mind-body-world unity that isn't a sort of vague metaphysical thing, but rather something he analyzes through how he sees them coming together through psychological experiments and philosophical possibilities. So that idea of the embodied mind and the world as being poles of a relationship, to me, is a quite beautiful idea. I go back to Merleau-Ponty all the time. I must have read his Phenomenology of Perception 7 times. But that's the one I was coming up with.
Yeah, I actually don't know much about Merleau-Ponty at all. But what I do know based on what I've heard is that he talks about the body a lot. Whereas people like Heidegger, for example, don't really at all talk about the body. Like being in time is just like a Kantian type of transcendental analytic, for example. Whereas I feel that kind of intimacy, for example, that can be gained by actually thinking of ourselves not as some kind of subject in which, we perceive and we have a type of active power and the world is out there to behold, an inert kind of substance, for example, to sever that and really to just actually it almost sounds like a form of monism. Like it reminds me of Spinoza a lot,
There is
where
a
everything is
monism
immanent.
to it. Yeah, there is a certain monism to it. Merleau-Ponty was rejected as a phenomenologist by the people who came after it: Foucault, Deleuze, Derrida, Lyotard, those folks. And that, I think, AJ, is in accordance with there seems to be a law of French philosophy, which is you must reject the generation before you. Even if you don't want to, that's the law. So you have to do that. But in rejecting him as a phenomenologist, they thought that Merleau-Ponty just saw everything through subjective experience. But in fact, what he shows is subjective experience isn't simply subjective. It involves this intertwining, this monism, as you call it. So I've argued that in order to understand a philosopher like Foucault and his discussion of the body, you actually need Merleau-Ponty as a background, not to move away from him, but to adopt him.
Yeah, absolutely. So when you teach, for example, do you try to give your students a background on Merleau-Ponty before you talk about these later like post-structuralists and such?
Not so much. I mentioned it. The problem with Merleau-Ponty is he's very difficult. I've taught courses on Merleau-Ponty, and I don't have a graduate program, so I can push my undergraduates only so far.
Sure.
But I'll mention I have done Foucault, who is actually in some ways easier to do in a course than Merleau-Ponty. Uh, and I've sort of mentioned that, but to go back to Merleau-Ponty within a seminar of Foucault was too much.
Yeah, and that makes sense because even though obviously someone like Foucault's a really complex thinker, we live in a really, really political age, for example, where a lot of the ideas that he talks about are directly relevant to the lives of younger people as such, whereas for the corporeality of the body and, a quasi-phenomenological way it's like very, very abstract. So I can see how almost teaching Foucault like to an undergraduate level, whereas maybe not Merleau-Ponty would be a bit more intuitive, kind of, to just the sort of trajectory that we're on as students.
I think that's right, AJ. There's another aspect of it as well, which is Foucault got easier. His writings got easier as he went along. He went through this period after the May '68, all that upheaval, and started to work with the prisons. And he started writing in such a way that prisoners and other people could read the writings. They weren't easy, but they were readable. And so there's a break in his writing. Before the mid 1970s, he's extraordinarily difficult. Then picking up with like Discipline and Punish and History of Sexuality, they're easier. The lectures that were published after his death for philosophy, they're just page turners.
I've heard that. I've heard that there. I read a book by Graham Harman a while ago, and he described the Foucault lectures as something where you can go through 500 pages in an afternoon. It's just so like beautiful to go through the prose and such.
Yeah, it would be a long afternoon, but yeah.
So, talk to me a little bit about how Merleau-Ponty's view of corporeality and how the relationship to the body and the world is actually more so like how you described it, like being like different parts of a pole of one relationship rather than actually being dualistic, maybe has like affected your visceral experience in the world as a human being. What about you? Did you feel almost maybe changed as you like began to read that work and feel its significance? Because it almost feels like it's a type of significance that's felt more than thought.
Well, and Merleau-Ponty does write about emotions in their relationships to things like art. So when he talks about painting, for instance, he'll say, you don't so much see a painting as see in accordance with the painting. The world looks different when you've encountered a painting that's really resonant for you. And on the one hand, I would say, as you said earlier, AJ, that the abstraction of the analysis isn't immediately visceral for me. What's visceral for me is the beauty of it. But the ideas themselves can sort of inform why I feel viscerally the way I do about the world. So I don't feel it through the philosophy, but the philosophy helps me understand why it is that I'm engaged and caught up in the world in some of the ways that I am.
Yeah. Like, could you give me maybe like just one maybe example of how like to give you an analogy for me, sometimes one thing that I really enjoy about reading philosophy is it really messes with my sense of subjectivity in the first place. Like there's a book by a philosopher named Michel Serres called The Five Senses. It's a really, really beautiful book. And there's one part in it where it's very playful. He talks about putting your finger up to your lips and your fingers are the subject and your lips are the object, and then you kiss your finger and all of a sudden the role is reversed, for example. And like I did that while I was reading the book and I was like, oh wow, that's so bizarre. It gave me a very weird feeling where again just my sense of being some type of isolated ego here with the world out there all of a sudden just started to crumble, and it didn't feel like an illusion in a kind of nihilistic way, but it made me feel just more like actually like a region of the world. So how in that kind of way, could you point to maybe like an experience you've had reading that where maybe your sense of like subjectivity dissolved, or you really felt like you were embodying like Ponty's philosophy in that sense?
With Merleau-Ponty, it's interesting, AJ, you bring up that example, because Merleau-Ponty has a very similar example where he talks about hands touching hands. So your hands go together. So one is feeling and one is felt, but that's reversible, right?
Yeah.
And that's an experience that one could have. I could also point to what to me was a really compelling example he used at the outset of phenomenology perception. So he talked about various visual illusions. So there's the Mueller-Lyer line, right? These two lines that if you have the two lines and then arrows pointing outwards with one, and then the one below it arrows pointing inwards, and the two lines are the same length, but they won't look the same length because
Right.
the ones with the arrows pointing inwards will look shorter than the one with the arrows pointing outwards. Okay, that's the illusion.
Yeah.
Now, Merleau-Ponty says, look, if all our bodies were information processes for what's out in the world, the two lines would look the same because they out in the world, in a sense, they are the same, right? But they don't get perceived that way. So it can't be just a processing of what's in the world on the one hand, but it can't just be our placing stuff out there in the world because there are lines out there. So what must be happening is an interaction between my corporeality and the world to get this perception to arise. This perception illusion, right, is not something that comes from this part of the world engaging in that part of the world, but a relationality between the two that in which this third thing arises, as it were, right? The perception. And if that's the case, then body and world must be perceptually, right, poles of a relationship rather than two distinct things, one of which is affecting, right, or causing the experience of the other.
Yeah, absolutely. No, I really, really like that example because it's almost as if optical illusions kind of end up like poking holes in our sense of just being like beings that mirror the world.
That's right.
Exists, for example.
That's right. Right.
Yeah.
Right. We don't mirror. We're not just mirrors of the world, and the world isn't simply what we place on it.
Yeah, absolutely. So I feel like this is actually a really good segue into a question about a philosopher who we were talking a little bit about before we started this call, Deleuze. And I read your introduction on him, which was really beautifully written, and I had a lot of fun reading it too. I read it way more slowly than I read more books because I kind of equate reading a book to being in a museum, where some museums you walk in and you go and you look at everything pretty quickly, and you're in kind of a substantial flow. Basically, there's a very consistent pacing. And then there are some museums you go into and you end up just getting like really, really like captured by like everything you see, maybe because just the artifacts happen to be really aesthetically pleasing to you that day. And you end up spending all day in the museum and you realize, oh no, I only looked at like 5 different things. That's kind of how I felt like when I was reading your book, because I would read a sentence and then think about it for, 15 minutes. It was a really great experience. But it's about Deleuze, who was a 20th century philosopher, post-structuralist, postmodern, but you delivered his work in a way that seemed like it has a lot of direct relevance to anybody in a pretty substantial way. It's not just abstract jargon, for example. It's meaningful work that can have an influence on any kind of life. So if you don't mind, talk a little bit about Deleuze, who he was, how he was significant, and what his work can be for anybody.
Good. Let me start, AJ, a little bit autobiographically, because I came to Deleuze through Foucault, and I came to both of them through their work criticizing psychology, contemporary psychology. I was a psychology graduate student, and I got thrown out of the program. Basically,
really?
I started reading Foucault and Deleuze, and their critiques of psychology. Foucault, most of the critique of psychology, Deleuze, the critique of psychoanalysis. And that sort of started me off on reading both of those philosophers more deeply. Now, as far as Deleuze goes, if you've read any of him, he's just a bear. He's just extraordinarily difficult to read. And my view is sometimes it's like, come on, dude, right?
Yeah.
You don't have to be this obscure this often. But I think the core idea, the one that I've pulled out for myself, uh, that there's always more to reality than we experience, is one that really has grabbed me, partly because it's a very optimistic idea. And in that sense, Deleuze is a very optimistic philosopher. He thinks that what you see is not necessarily all that there is. And of course, in this time and place in the world, that's a comforting thought. But so if I could use an example that I've used before to try to capture this core idea, that and I think this is in the book. In the book, I talk about the infant brain, right?
The what brain? Sorry,
the brain of the infant.
I think so. What would that have been in the science, thought, and language
Probably.
chapter?
Probably.
Okay.
It was when I started thinking about his relation to science that I started to feel like I got him. So, AJ, think of it this way: that the infant brain doesn't have your personality there in it, right? It's not like AJ, when you're an infant, right? The AJ that is before us, right, is not there.
Yeah.
And there's not some menu of possible AJs that could show up, right? Right? None of that is there. Many things can emerge from this infant brain, but this infant brain isn't a particular, right? It isn't a particular AJ. So the idea is that this infant brain is, to use Deleuze's term, is like a virtuality, right? That doesn't have any particular identities. There's no AG identities in there, but any number of AG identities can emerge from it. Now, not just any AJ, right? Like whatever it is that was going to emerge from your infant brain, it wasn't going to be like a seagull, right? It was going to be something that was sort of recognizably human.
Yeah.
But the AJ that emerged was an AJ that wasn't there in germ, but that could be a way in which that virtual brain could actualize itself into a particular person through its engagement in the world. What that means is that if we think of reality that way, that means that reality is a combination of, we say, the virtuality and the actuality, where every actuality, what's there, contains the seeds of more, something else, but not the seeds like a menu, right? You have to investigate it to find out what it is.
Yeah.
And so it's as though the actuality, what we experience, and the virtuality, right, are intertwined in such a way that everything can become, if we allow it that way, everything can become an experiment. And that's why my guiding question in the book was the question of how might one live, right?
Yeah.
As an invitation to experiment. I should say that the original title of the book, the one that I submitted to the press, was Gilles Deleuze's Guide to Living, which was meant to had double meaning, right? Like what is life? It's this virtual actual thing, but also opening up to new possibilities of living. And the editors said, yeah, we're not going to do that because if we call it Deleuze an introduction, it'll sell a lot more copies. So that's why it's.
Sometimes you just got to take one for the publishing house, you know.
yeah, and they pretty much had veto power over that one.
And what I really, really liked a lot about Deleuze's idea of the virtual is that it's not just potential. In fact, it's actually Deleuze's way of getting away from the idea of potential, because as you talked about in your book, for something to be potential or possible, it's really to be a representation of an actual that just is not really. For example, you have a particular mental image of an event that could happen, but just isn't. Whereas the virtuality for Deleuze is almost like, the best way that I can describe it is it's almost like a multiplicity of like emergence, for example, in the sense that I remember you used the analogy of genetic information, for example, and how the way in which the genetic information, it's not literally information, for example, but it's almost always caught in translation, basically, with the environment. And that aspect, that always being caught in translation, is almost its virtuality. It's a different type of being fully imminently real, which I thought was really, really beautiful and significant. I was trying to think of my own analogies to understand the concept better, and I was thinking about how, for example, binary machine code on a computer, for example, it's all ones and zeros, but within any given sequence of that, there's actually a multiplicity of virtual emergence for new information from that. Like, who knows, maybe that is actually, I don't want to use the word representation, but maybe that binary code, for example, in that moment is a phrase of English, actually, or like a mathematical equation or whatever. And it's only it's the type of, it's the way you modularize it through different programs that actualizes that as being actual, for example. But even when you just have the machine code on its own, it actually has a virtuality for that stuff. It's fully real.
Yeah, the difficulty, and you caught it here in something you said earlier, AJ, is that you've got to use analogies. And the reason you have to use analogies for the virtual field is that if you can say what it is, it's no longer virtual. It's actualized into an identity. Right? So we're using the term virtual and actual. We can also use the terms difference in itself for the virtual and identities for the actual. And if we use those terms, then we see that what Deleuze is calling difference in itself has to be something that cannot be identified directly. Because if it's identified directly, then it is, right, it's actualized into a particular identity. And this intertwining of actual and virtual is one where the actual is something we can discuss phenomenologically, we can experience or something like that. And the virtual is something that I sometimes use the word we can palpate, like a doctor palpates, right, to find out what's going on, but we can't actually see the identity of without, right, destroying it as the virtual. Another way to see the distinction between potential and real is that a fictional character would be a potential, right? It's an identity, right? The character has characteristics, things like that. It's described on the page, and if that person walked off the page, right, they'd be real. But they have an identity as potential. The virtual, right, doesn't have identity as a potential on the one hand, and on the other hand, unlike the fictional character, the virtual is real. And so there are these two differences. The potential is an identity that isn't real, whereas the virtual is a non-identity, right, that is real. The word multiplicity would be okay, but really when we talk about multiplicity and all of these terms, what we're trying to do is get a sense of something, perhaps analogically, that we can't really say what it is directly without betraying it.
Yeah, it reminds me a lot of that cultural epithet, you know it when you see it, for example.
Right, except you don't see it, right?
Yeah. Yeah, you know it. It almost makes me think of like a dog chasing its tail, for example, where, like maybe some like hair, falls off the dog's tail and is hitting the dog's face, for instance. But it's always in this process of like there are forms of it being actualized, but it's something that actually never comes full circle. It's a really interesting concept. And I feel like I definitely feel like I don't have a super, super rich understanding of that idea of the virtual yet, and that it's something I need to grow with, for example. But it definitely made me feel that the distinction between reality and representation, the very traditional one, is like very impoverished, for example. Because
I think that's right.
Yeah, because it values the actual as being like the real, full stop, for example.
Yes.
And anything else is not real.
Yes. And the thing about this concept is you have to kind of feel your way into it. But some concepts are abstract in the sense that they're just very difficult, right? That it's hard to do the inferential work to wrap your mind around it. Whereas this one is not a matter of getting all the right inferences. It's just a matter of getting a feel for what he's on about. And whenever I teach introductions to Deleuze, and I do this with a lot of non-philosophers, their first impression is always one of confusion. I don't get it, I don't get it, I don't get it. But if I stay with them for a couple of hours, for many of them, the world just begins to look like that. It's like, oh yeah, this is right. This has to be right. So
yeah,
there's
it forms
a certain
kind of intuition
character, but you have to feel your way in. You can't just infer your way in step by step through reason.
Totally. And I've absolutely experienced that with writing, for example. I write a little bit of fiction just as a hobby. And one thing that I noticed is after I read your book on Deleuze, when I was writing, as words were, the first words of, a given idea or story were going onto the page, I would almost see that as a virtual field in the sense of, well, like actually what lies within these resonances and words and trajectories that I just created to explore. And it reminded me of a quote by Rainer Maria Rilke, when he said that for the poet, there is no such thing as an impoverished place. And I feel like that gets at the heart of Deleuze a lot in terms of just a life philosophy. There is no impoverished place when you have difference and you have virtuality, because there is always reality to behold. It's something that is being actualized, but there is always more. And I think you use that phrase verbatim several times. There is always more.
Right. I mean, the impoverishment would be seeing the actual as all that there is.
Yeah, absolutely. And our role is to simply discover one of its new facts, for instance. Write it in the long list of facts about the world, for instance.
What can be created that isn't already there?
Yeah. So I wanted to ask you about your trajectory as a philosophical author, because what really caught my eye about you as I started to read philosophy in my junior year of college was that even though you had a lot of research that was heavily oriented in dense academic philosophy, like post-structuralism and so on and so forth, I noticed that you extensively write about a lot of topics that are about the everyday issues that kind of pervade our lives. You write about things that are very, very general to us as human beings. You have a book on death. You wrote a book about vulnerability, about daily ethics. And in academic philosophy, that's something that a lot of people avoid because there's a research mentality that really values the microscopic discovery, for instance. So I really appreciated how you bring philosophy down to earth, where in my opinion, it always is that way and has been that way, and culturally became kind of a lofty thing, even though I actually think that philosophy is the most earthly thing that there is in a way. But you show that philosophy is really down to earth. You contributed to The Good Place, which was an NBC sitcom that really utilized philosophy a lot to great success. And you did a few skits for and with them on YouTube, some of which I watched and I really, really enjoyed. So the question is, what inspired your life along this trajectory to make philosophy really available to everybody? I'm really interested to hear about that because it was meaningful to me to get that experience reading your stuff.
Good. Let me say something about the history of philosophy and then swing back to the autobiographical. Right? The history of philosophy is such, or the history of Western philosophy is such that if you go at least back to ancient Greek philosophy, not the pre-Socratics, but the Socratics, Aristotle, the Stoics, the Epicureans, they were interested in the question of how one should live. What's the best life for a human being? And people call themselves philosophers not if they came up with a new doctrine, right? They call themselves philosophers if they were living in accordance with a doctrine. That there was a doctrine of the best life that made sense to them, and they were trying to enact that. And what happened over the course of time, and this is something that was argued by the historian of ancient philosophy, Pierre Hadot, is that philosophy moved into sort of academic and university settings. And as it did that, it became more divorced from the immediacy of concerns of how one should live, and became more of, we could say, an analytic project, analytic activity. And then with the sort of more recent, and by recent I mean 40, 50 years, focus on publication, then the question is, okay, what can I say, however obscure, that hasn't already been said by somebody else? And then we're moving another step away from what philosophy might be for us. Now, I don't want to say there's no value in some of these obscure and arcane moves, right? Sometimes they can be really helpful. But I think what's happened is there's been an imbalance. The focus on that has basically resulted in a neglect of addressing the larger issues and addressing issues for larger audiences. So what happened was, earlier on, I was always trying to be clear as I could be, even when I was writing about Foucault and Deleuze and folks like that. Partly, AJ, because when I was a graduate student, there was a lot of jargon going around.
Sure.
And I didn't understand what people were saying. And I just thought it was me. This must be my problem. So I spent time trying to translate the jargon that I was hearing into terms I could understand. And by the time I was writing, that was just natural to do. So I tried to be as clear as possible, even in the earlier writings. But in the earlier writings, you're caught up in academics. You're trying to make some publications and get tenure, et cetera, et cetera. So that's there as well. But at some point, I think two things happened for me. One was that I realized I didn't have to do this anymore. I could write what I wanted and people were going to publish it or not publish it. And I've been fortunate that people have wanted to publish it. And so it's allowed me to write about larger questions in ways that aren't immediately recognized as part of the academic project. So that's one thing. Right? The other thing, AJ, is that you hit a certain age, and as one of my teachers once put it, it's as though you can see the far shore of your life more clearly than the shore you set out from. And when that happens, you really start to think. And I really wanted to grapple with questions that were important life questions to me. They became more urgent.
Yeah.
Right? How might I live? What is it to be decent? How do I deal with my own suffering? Things like that. And as I thought those through and tried to grapple with them, then tried to use writing as a way to grapple, but also as a way to try to communicate that grappling I was doing with other people, right, who might be thinking about similar issues, not necessarily in the philosophical field.
Yeah. No, I really like what you just said about using writing simultaneously as therapy and communication, because it actually made me think of what you were just talking about with Merleau-Ponty, whereas in some kind of way, catharsis and communication are like different polarities of the same relationship in a lot of ways. Like,
yeah, I think they can be.
Yeah.
They can be. Right. You can have catharsis that's not communicating; it's just some guy blathering on, right? And you can have communication that's not cathartic, but there can be, I think you're right, this meeting point. And I think that meeting point was the one that a lot of my recent stuff has been trying to occupy.
Yeah. So it makes me think of one of your books that you wrote on death, for example, and how in your book you talk about how death is the central theme of us because it actually organizes our lives in the way that it gives it a certain impetus towards immediacy and purpose that we wouldn't have, for example, if we were immortal, which that made me think a lot of different fictional instances, for example, in Lord of the Rings with the elves and such, where they're immortal. And it made me think of those things in a new light. But one thing that I was thinking about as I was reading that book is the fact that, like, and you just mentioned, our age plays a large role in terms of what seems immediate and why, and so on and so forth. And I feel that in terms of death, for example, there's a certain intimate relationship with it that a younger person may not have, that like someone who's older might, for example. Like, I feel like, for example, our positions on death are radically different from each other, not just in an intellectual way, but just in a kind of embodied experiential way, for example. So would you be willing to maybe like talk about that and like what death is in terms of how people experience it based on their age, for instance?
Yeah. And I want to be careful not to generalize too much, right? Because AJ, you know, there are people who are younger who can come to a relationship with death that some people who are older come to. They just come to an understanding and thought, and vice versa. There can be people who are older who just they're not going to touch this thing or grapple with it or think about it, right? Which is not necessarily a bad thing, but it means that they're in that sense like many people who are younger. But it is the case, I think, that you do start to think about death more often the closer you think you're coming to it. And so, for instance, I'm at 66, I'll be 67 in a few months. And I noticed there are things my body can't do that it used to do. And that is sort of one of those intimations of mortality that leads you back to thinking about death. But I taught a course on death once. I only taught it once. I would never teach it again. It was too difficult, right? Because I didn't want to just do philosophical theories of death. I wanted to have an encounter. And I worked with students who were all undergraduates, all seniors.
Yeah.
And you could tell that they felt it, right? That they could put themselves eventually in that presence. And that taught that course, it must be 20 years ago practically. And I still have students from that course contact me and tell me their thoughts, right, as they grow older around all this. So I think the idea that you can see the far shore of your life more clearly than the one you set out does have an effect on many people. I don't want to go so far as to say that young people can't have it and that all people who get older do have it. But I think it can have some effect. Aristotle, in some of his moods, seemed to think that that younger people could only understand certain things, and older people could understand only certain things. But that seems to me something that is that has some truth in it, but that you can take that too far if you try to generalize it. So here's where young people all are at, and here's where older people all are at.
Yeah, of course, because there are always going to be like leaks through the cracks, for example, and exceptions. I guess I sometimes wonder, for example, I have moments, for example, where my mortality becomes very, very like transparent all of a sudden, and I kind of have a moment of like I kind of have like a grim epiphany or something like that, and I am in that space, quote unquote. And I think the word understanding that I use may have been a poor one, because it's less so almost a difference of understanding that I wonder about, and simply a difference of inevitable embodiment, for example, like how when we like grow older, for example, there are things that we can't do that we used to be able to, and so on and so forth. Because I totally believe that there are moments where like younger people have a quote unquote like a deep understanding of death, and there are moments where an older person will just skirt around the issue. So yeah, I totally best way to put it is I kind of just wonder how death is something that almost like evolves with a person, for example, if that makes sense.
I think we often do have an evolving relationship with death. You talked about things you can no longer do that you once did, which I think is right. Uh, the other side of it is that you really think to yourself, look, the time I got left is limited, and what is it that I'm going to do? What haven't I done? What do I need to do in this limited time that I have left? And when I was younger, I never thought in terms of the limited time I have left in the way
Yeah.
that I do now.
Yeah. It increases, especially if you're a sensitive person, it increases the awareness that you have of like your vulnerability in the
Yeah,
world. Because the fact that we are temporal beings is actually intrinsically interwoven with the fact that we're vulnerable. Like that's a
yeah,
mode of it, you know.
yeah. That's
And
true.
you wrote about vulnerability, and this day and age, specifically with the pandemic, is a time in which I think that COVID is almost a phenomenon that just makes us extraordinarily explicitly aware of our vulnerability. I noticed that a lot with family and friends because I will hear people talk about a lot, and I'll talk about myself. Like for example, um, my girlfriend is a public school teacher, and she will be worried, for instance, about coming home from school and knowing that like a couple kids in her class like had COVID, for instance, and she's worried about getting it and so on and so forth. And that's just one example, but there are like many others with many different people. And I have noticed that it attunes us to the kind of counterfactual hypothetical awareness that we have of things that can happen that have the possibility of disrupting our lives, for instance. And how do you think that that's something, how do you think we should tackle that, for instance? Or how do you think that maybe this has the possibility to open us up in a new way and make us maybe more empathetic towards each other, for instance? And if that is a hyper optimistic view, but what is your view on vulnerability, especially during this time where it seems to come to the fore as a theme so much?
Yeah. I think there's a something that's been very disappointing to me on the one hand, and something that's intriguing to me on the other. So the disappointment has been ethical. Uh, my hope, and I actually wrote about this in a Times Stone piece at the beginning of the pandemic, was that we would come to recognize our solidarity with one another, the fact that we're in an ethical web with one another, and that everything we do affects people in different ways, and that recognition would lead toward more solidarity. That I think has not happened. I mean, it's happened in some places, but I think in general it has not. Uh, Part of that is the legacy of neoliberalism and the kind of individualism that it promotes. Margaret Thatcher's famous phrase that there is no such thing as society. Uh, so I think that has left a legacy that's affected how people deal with the coronavirus. More recent political developments, I think, have fostered that as well. We need to get too far into that. But it has been an ethical disappointment to me that people have not sort of recognized one another's vulnerabilities and developed more empathy toward one another, more solidarity with them. Uh, on the positive side, there's this interesting phenomenon I'm sure you've heard of, AJ, called the Great Resignation. That people are not going back to their jobs, that they're refusing to do some of the things that they used to do. And my speculation about this is that the reason that that's happening, or at least one reason that that's happening, is that people have been thrown back on themselves and ask themselves, is this really what I want out of my life? Right? Whereas before COVID, people would just go along and do what they need to do day by day and not really reflect on their lives. I think COVID has thrown a number of people back to the question of who am I, and is this really the way that I want to live? And I think that what's called the Great Resignation reflects a number of things. But I think one of the things that it reflects is that people being thrown back on themselves and asking themselves how they want to live and looking at the ways in which they have lived, and particularly the jobs they've had, and saying to themselves, this is just not something I want.
Yeah, it makes me think a lot about how this great resignation, it's almost like interruption of society's collective continuous consciousness, for example, that runs by habit, for example. And it reminds me a lot of how another philosopher Heidegger talks a lot about how when we are in circumspection, or basically working with tools in such a way that our awareness kind of withdraws from them, that the only moment when we have a moment of reflection, for example, is when the tool breaks, for
Right.
example. And to like bring the analogy to like a higher order level, it almost seems like that has happened with society in a way. And like the way that Heidegger puts it is kind of in a negative light, because that's how you end up seeing things as just entities, for example. But in this sense, it's actually a form of redirected consciousness that like may inspire new habits, for example, rather than this just state of catatonic inertia, for
Yeah.
example.
Yeah, I think that's right. People become aware. People get well. If we use this a Heideggerian type analogy, right? You get in your car, you drive to work. You don't think about your car. Right? Your car is not thematic. It's not salient. It's not present to you until you hear that grinding noise under the hood. And then your car becomes very present to you. You're thrown back on reflecting on something that you had just taken for granted. And I think in that sense, right, COVID is the grinding under the engine. Right?
Yeah. So it's in the grinding in the engine is like us, our lives.
Yeah.
You know, and that's also had a lot to do with the fact that the pandemic has caused a lot of isolation in different ways. You know, during the beginning of the pandemic, there was a probably 3-month period where I really wasn't able to see many people at all, for example. Like I didn't see my girlfriend for 3 months. I didn't see any of my best friends for months. And one, it gave me a different way of valuing my relationships, for example, and like not taking them for granted, quote unquote, but really seeing the actual type of potential that lies within getting to be like physically present with another person that you care about, like the types of possibilities that are opened up in comparison to simply being able to chat with them online. Like, wow, when I'm with a person, physically we can go like on a hike somewhere. That's actually something that physicality makes available. And it makes, in some sort of way, it was like my world being impoverished a bit that actually made me realize how rich it was, for example, which was something that I appreciated about the beginning of the pandemic. For you personally, what like directions did the pandemic, especially at first, like spur you in, for example?
Well, I don't think, AJ, that necessarily something terribly deep happened. I mean, the first thing it did was spur me into thinking, okay, this is going to be a while. And what are things that over the years I haven't read that I could reread because I'm not going anywhere anytime soon, right? So I think those reflections came up, but I don't think that, and I'll tell you why. I don't think that I went through sort of those kind of deep life reflections, and I think the reason for that is that that's what I've been trying to do for years through the writing and the thinking and things like that. That's, I put it this way, that's what I get paid for, is to think about these things. So that form of reflection, which other people didn't have, in part because it wasn't part of what they were encouraged to do. But there was a space created in which this became a thing for them. It's not that people don't think about their lives, but they don't get paid to do it. And so they do it sort of on their own time. But now there was a lot more time to do that. Whereas I was in a position that this is the thing that I have been doing for some time. And therefore, I don't think anything terribly new came out of it for me.
Yeah, so it almost seems like, based on your like collective position of life, that the pandemic was less of a paradigm shift for you, maybe. Whereas in my experience, because what actually happened was, on top of the pandemic, I actually graduated with the pandemic. It started in about February or so of 2020, and I got sent home from school as well as everybody else, and we graduated college virtually. It was a very rude awakening to the world, that experience of being that graduating class, for instance. So it definitely, all the tools and all the gears were in the right place for that to be a like very monumental kind of like undoing, like, of perspective for me.
Yeah, that's right.
So relating to vulnerability, and you touched on this a little bit earlier when you were talking about maybe your disappointment of the ethics with COVID, has to do with the idea of what it takes for an everyday person to live an ethical life, to live ethically enough, for instance. And because, again, philosophy is one of those areas where morality and ethics has become obsessed so much with details that the morality almost becomes a bit satiated, more so than any other region of philosophy. I'll notice myself feeling like, oh, what does this have to do? Like whether or not the like categorical imperative holds an X number of possible worlds, that type of stuff. It makes me, I feel more so almost like I'm reading like logic or math than like ethics in a lot of cases. So what, in your opinion, is the way to approach, philosophical ethics for people who are interested in ethics, maybe?
Good.
And how it can be applied to their lives.
Good. And being more ethical. Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, I think that the problem with ethics is, I think, a problem, not that it's more abstract than, say, philosophy of science or philosophy of mind or anything like that, but the expectation is that it's going to hook on somehow to our activities and our behavior. And whereas we don't expect that as much from philosophy of mind or philosophy of science.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So the question then becomes, how might we approach that? And I think there is in ethics, there's room for this abstract, divorced, it's an ethical and meta-ethical reflection. Right? But as I said earlier, I think there's an imbalance. We often don't think in terms, we philosophers, in terms of how do we communicate our ethical reflections to a wider audience. And that's what my book, A Decent Life, is trying to do. I should say that there are people who do that. Peter Singer does that in a very different way.
Yeah.
In fact, the origin of my book, A Decent Life, came out of a conversation I had with my editor at Chicago Press. Because I emailed her, said, I don't know, I've written a bunch, I don't know if I've got anything more to say. And she said, well, can we talk on the phone? So we usually email, but we talked on the phone. And she said, I've been thinking about what you said about not having something anymore to say. And she said, I asked myself the question, well, what would Todd write that I would want to read? And she said, do you know Peter Singer's book, The Most Good You Can Do? Right? This is where Peter Singer talks about effective altruism, people who give up their kidneys or take jobs on Wall Street, making a lot of money so they can give it all away. And basically people who go to ethical extremes. And I said, I know that book. And she said, I think you should write that book, The Most Good You Could Do, for sane people. And immediately I knew what she was talking about, right? Those of us who are not going to take Wall Street jobs just so we can give money away or give our kidneys away. So that's where that book came out of, and it was trying to think about that, right, and communicate that. But I should, I guess, make a plug for another book that's coming out in about 2 weeks.
Oh, please do.
Yeah, well, it's not my book, although I was the advisor to this book.
Okay.
So you've mentioned the show The Good Place. So the showrunner in The Good Place is Mike Schur, and Mike Schur, he's written a book, and I was advising him on the book. And it's coming out in 2 weeks with Simon & Schuster. It's a book of ethics that's very much on the ground, but also he's a comic writer. It's very funny. And so the book's title is How to Be Perfect, and the subtitle is something like What to Do in Every Possible Moral Situation, or something like that. Right? But it's fun. It's funny. It's rigorous. Mike Schur was very... he was obsessive about getting the philosophies right. There's one moment when they were trying to pry the manuscript of it from his hands recently, just to get it into production, because he kept trying to be more precise. And I get an email from him saying, "Todd, is this footnote right? Right? I'm not sure this footnote's right. Could you reread the article and make sure I'm right on this footnote?" So the philosophy is rigorous. The book is funny, and it's very much on the ground for folks. So I think that those books are out there. I think My Decent Life book is a readable book. The Peter Singer is interesting to think with because he's so extreme, but he's also very readable. And so I think if you poke around, you can find this stuff, but it isn't as prominent as I think it should be.
Yeah, absolutely. That sounds like a really, really exciting book. I'm actually excited to get my hands on a copy when it comes out. 2 weeks, you said?
Yeah, 2 weeks from Tuesday.
Okay, great. And you mentioned Peter Singer. Yeah, when I was reading A Decent Life, I remember you talking about him. And correct me if I'm wrong, but from what I remember, he almost subscribes to this an altered form of consequentialism, where basically, if you there is basically always more suffering that you can prevent in every single moment. And if you are not putting in effort to reduce literally as much suffering as physically capable, then it's not good or immoral or so on and so forth. There's a really extreme sense of there's always more that you can do, and it's actually not moral if you don't do it.
That's
for
right.
instance.
That's right. He's a pretty straight ahead utilitarian.
Yeah.
So the idea is you always ought to cause the most good. That means that you should sacrifice up to the point where your sacrificing would cause less good than the sacrifices that you make.
Yeah. Tell me what your alternative directly was to Peter Singer's idea and how you incorporated it into your book.
Well, there are a couple of things. One is that I'm glad there are people like that in the world. It's just that most of us aren't going to go there. So the question is, how do we think about our lives if we're not going to go there? But the other side of it is, it seems to me that I'm not sure I would want everybody to be like this. Susan Wolf, the philosopher from North Carolina, has argued, and I think compellingly, that a lot would get lost if we were all trying to make the world better. A lot of arts would get lost. A lot of sense of the shape and meaning of our own lives would get lost. And it still might be the case that the world would be better with less art and less meaningful lives. That there'd be less suffering. But it seems to me that that seems a world that's impoverished in another way that I'm not sure I would want to see. So the alternative that I developed or suggested is that we think of everybody as having a life to live, that there are other people out there and they have lives, and they're afraid of dying, and they want their life to be meaningful, and they don't want to be lonely, and they have basic physical and psychological needs and things like that, and that we take that into account as we move through the world. And the book is about different ways in which we can take that into account. in our relationship to people close to us, our relationship to strangers, our relationship to following generations, our relationship to animals, our relationship to politics. How might we take that single insight, and by insight I don't mean my insight, I mean something I think people would recognize, and weave that into the ways in which we're navigating through the world?
Yeah. And not only do I think that if we were all pursuing to make each other's lives as good as possible in a very direct way, like you mentioned, would the world be impoverished in different ways? I actually think that there are a lot of aspects in which the world may be surprisingly directly impoverished of good, like what even Peter Singer would consider good, because of the fact that, like, going back to Deleuze, we know not what a body can do, or Spinoza, right, really, or like the virtuality of things, how there is always more. And there are a lot of, for example, scientific discoveries in like chemistry, like abstract chemistry, which may have direct medical applications 2 decades later that were never actually intended. But sometimes I wonder, well, if we all formed a hive mind where we collectively agreed to help aid each other's suffering as much as humanly possible, part of me actually thinks that maybe we'd like go extinct, actually. Like that, actually, or that something almost catastrophic would end up like some kind of butterfly effect, if that was actually being applied.
Right. Although here would be Singer's response.
Okay. Right? Yeah, I'd love to hear that.
Yeah, his response would be, if that's what would happen, we shouldn't do it because that's not the best outcome.
Yeah.
Right. And I guess they always have that response.
The question is, like, how can you account for the relationship between a local and a global consequence, for example? Right. And that I think is a question that everybody in that position really has to fight with.
Yeah. Fair.
But Todd, it was really, really fun doing this. I really loved talking to you, and this was great. Just thank you so much for coming on. I had a really, really good time.
This has been my pleasure, AJ. I'm glad you're doing this, and I think it's a real contribution.
Thank you. Thank you so much for watching. If you enjoyed, please consider liking and maybe even subscribing to the channel, as it really helps a lot. Let me know in the comments sections if you have any ideas of future guests you'd like to see on the road to reason. So long.